Jim scrambled down beside him, his feet slipping on lumps of coal as he landed. The inside of the lighter was like a black cave, gleaming with heaps of coal. It smelt of damp and sulphur. Nick thrust a shovel at Jim. The basket hovered just above the hold, and Nick eased it down, steadied it, and started shoveling coal into it, his body swinging into a deep, easy rhythm. Jim stabbed at the coals with his shovel. He had to lift it nearly as high as himself before he could tip it into the basket, and the few coals he managed to lift slid off and bumped against him. He gave a little yelp of pain, and Nick stopped shoveling for a moment. He whistled in contempt. "Get on with it," he shouted. Jim panted, trying to slide his shovel under the lumps of coal again, and Nick threw his down and swore at him. He banged his head across the back of Jim's head and came to stand beside him, reaching round Jim so his hands were gripping the haft just above Jim's own, forcing Jim to swing into his own level rhythm of shoveling and lifting, shoveling and lifting. When he let go, Jim's hands were burning. Jim did his best to keep up, lifting just 2 or 3 coals at a time to Nick's shovelful, bending and lifting, as if this were all there was to do in the world. At last the basket was full. Nick yelled up to the whiteface, and the bucket creaked away from them as if it was winched upon its rope to the top story of the building. Nick swung himself up onto the hatchboards, and somehow Jim pulled himself up after him, rolling well away from the dog. Day had come, grey as pigeons. The man picked up a pail and emptied water out of it into the cooking pot on the small stove. "Get some more," he said to Jim. "There's a pump in the yard." As Jim jumped across the planks of the landing stage, he heard Nick say to the dog, "Watch him, Snipe." The dog leaped after him, skulking round his legs as he ran, nipping his ankles. From the back of the warehouse he could hear the rumble of the coals as he slid down a chute on the waiting cart. The empty basket creeped down towards the lily. Jim pumped water into the pail and ran as steadily as he could back to the lighter, the water slopping out against his legs, and Snipe nosed against him. Nick had lit a fire on the stove, and he poured some water onto a mess of gruel in the cooking pot. "Stir that," he said to Jim, "and don't take all day." Jim watched over the gruel until it was beginning to thicken, then lowered himself down onto the hold again and swung painfully back into Nick's rhythm. His stomach was beginning to growl with hunger. When the next basket was full, they went back up, and Nick ladled the gruel into 2 bowls. They ate it fast, squatting on their haunches by the heat of the stove, and when the basket was lowered down again, they left their bowls and set back to work. They spent the entire day shoveling coal in this way. There were tons and tons of it. From time to time, the white face would appear at the window and shout down to them that the cart was full and that they would have to wait for another. At these times, they both stretched themselves full length on the hatchboards of the Lily, cold though they were. Jim would fall asleep immediately and would be kicked awake by Nick or roused by a shout from Whiteface so that the baskets were coming down again. His bones seemed to set while he slept. He could hardly kneel or stand, but he was so afraid of Nick and of the yellow-eyed dog that he lumbered up like an old man and hobbled to his job. A long time after dark, Whiteface shouted down that he was going home and they could finish for the day. Jim could hardly crawl by then. His shoulders felt as there were knots of pain in them they would never undo. Nick put some potatoes in the pot and passed Jim some water to drink. He gurgled it down, his throat dry and parched with coal dust, and dozed off again until the potato was ready. He ate it, clutched it in his palm, burning his skin, peeling it with his teeth, the way Nick did. He was glad of it and of the heat from the fire. He saw that Nick ate meat with his potato and that he tossed what he didn't want of it to Snipe. During the entire day he would have only spoken about a dozen words to Jim. When he had finished his meal, Nick belched loudly and climbed off the lighter onto the plankway. Jim could hear him trudging down past the warehouse and up the alley and guessed he would be making for one of the alehouses behind the wharf. He was glad. All he wanted now was to go to sleep. There was a wooden locker with 2 benches and he guessed that these were to lie on. He rolled himself up on his sacking. He was so tired that he fell asleep at once. Somehow, though, his sleep, he heard Nick coming back. Full of good cheer, he saw him tousling Snipe's head and slipping him more meat from his pocket. He did take the bench back. He didn't take the bench next to Jim, but lowered himself down into the hold of the lighter, and Jim was glad of that too. Far out on the river, tugboats hooted. Beside Jim, the yellow dog snuffled on its paws and groaned. When Jim fell asleep again, he dreamt of his first home, the cottage, only it was made of coal, as walls and floors and ceilings were black and gleaming, reflecting the orange glow of the brazier. Each side of it, his mother and father sat with their hands stretched over the fire for warmth. His mother was just as he remembered her, pale and quiet, her dark hair smoothed back, but his father, whose face he never saw in his dreams, looked like grimy Nick. He had a gap between his teeth and a frothy beard and grey thatchy hair, and his face was black with coal dust. His eyes were white rings like lights. Jim didn't mind in his dreams because it looked like a proper home, even though it was made of coal, and it had a name. He was sure of that. It was called the Lily. Well, there we go. And I will see you soon for the next chapter.